You dare assault me! You who have done far worse than I! I stood for my fellow angels, for reason and justice, and then he made you in his image. You, the flawed creation, and I was to bow down to you!
I first played Dante's Inferno by downloading the demo off of Xbox Live, and I quickly dismissed it as a simple God of War clone, and never thought about it again. That is until I picked up the PS3 version at GameStop almost a decade later. When I finally got around to playing it, intending to put up a simple gameplay sample of the game on YouTube, I realized 2 hours of time had already passed, and I was completely drawn into the game. While Dante's Inferno is very much a God of War clone even down to the control setup and the many QuickTime events, Visceral Games put enough spin on the formula to make Dante its own unique experience that is just as engrossing to play as God of War. The game loosely follows the 14th century epic poem of the same name and stars Dante, a crusader, who after an assassination attempt finds himself in a fight with the Grim Reaper, prevailing against which equips him with the scythe weapon he will use throughout the game. After prevailing against the Grim Reaper, Dante makes the long trip home only to find out that his beloved wife Beatrice has been murdered and taken by the devil thanks to a wager she made with the Prince of the Air. This sees Dante following her to the gates of hell and beyond, heading deeper and deeper into the bowels of hell. Abandon all hope, ye who enter these gates. For in life you were warned, but now mercy, compassion, love, and forgiveness are forever cut off, and there is nothing but eternal suffering here. The story premise pretty much reworks the original literary classic and weaves it into a new narrative, taking themes and level ideas from the epic poem, but using them to tell something new. Story elements are told through cutscenes and animated cartoon cells that remind me sort of that old HBO Spawn cartoon. Imagine the underworld levels in God of War, but stretched into an entire game, filled with dire spectacles of suffering in a place of no hope and no escape. The atmosphere and visual designs are unnerving and yet create the desired effect that gives visual representation to the kinds of images the classic poem alluded to, but could only exist in the imaginations of those who read it, or those who ponder what suffering for an eternity in hell would look like. As stated, this game draws most of its inspiration from God of War, even down to the attack commands on the controller. Even the mechanics like holding triangle to knock enemies into the air to follow them for air combo opportunities, and using the right stick to dodge away from enemies are identical. Different from God of War, Dante does have a long-range cross attack, which is useful against flying and distant enemies. When leveled up, the cross attack becomes one of the most useful and devastating attacks in the game. There's also a redemption mode, where Dante powers up to do a flurry of attacks at a faster speed and for more damage, similar to the Devil Trigger mode in Devil May Cry, you know, the other Dante. As players progress, killing enemies gains them souls they can spend in an in-game menu to gain new moves, more life, new abilities, and more. Special relics can also be found and equipped to boost various stats and abilities in the game as well. Players can fill either the holy or unholy sides and gain holy or unholy levels in the game by finding tortured souls they can either choose to punish or absolve from their sins. The choice is up to the player. On my first playthrough, I wasn't able to purchase all the skills on the skill tree, but beating the game opens up the option to play it again, starting out from the beginning of the game with all the skills you unlocked in your previous playthrough. Most of the footage here is from my second playthrough of the game, as I was so drawn into it I didn't even think to record my first run through. The ability to start the game with your previous skills unlocked and work towards fully unlocking all the skills gives a reason to play through this game multiple times. A very wise design choice on the part of the developer, making it feel almost pseudo-RPG-esque. It's impossible to talk about this game without bringing up God of War a lot because the game is a blatant God of War clone. Its set pieces are smaller in scale than God of War, but still impressive in their size and scope. Overall, the entire feel of the game is blatantly God of War. This, however, isn't a bad thing, because the formula it copies is still as enthralling as ever. If you are a God of War fan, Dante's Inferno will be right up your alley. However, if you were never a fan of God of War, Dante's Inferno won't be for you either. The part that Visceral Games nailed in the formula was the feel of combat. If you loved God of War's combat, Dante's Inferno is just as equally fun in that regard. Add in the long-range attacks and the redemption mode, and there is a mixture of God of War and Devil May Cry. The game has its own feel, with some new elements added like purchasing new combos, using the variety of relics you find, and acquiring, using, and upgrading the magic spells you gain throughout the game. The combat in the game is the star of the show, and some of the most enthralling of its kind for games of this type. As you play, you get the feeling that Dante is every bit as much of a badass as Kratos and, well, you know, the other Dante guy. The combat feel is outstanding in this game, and thanks to purchasing more combos and ability, gains more depth as you play. The other elements of the game, like the set pieces, atmosphere, exploration/puzzle elements, enemy variety, boss fights, and storytelling are also top-notch efforts. The imagery in the game is terrifying in its depiction of hell, with some truly unsettling visual designs to the levels and enemies in the game. The disturbing backdrop of hell being the setting is done justice with the art direction, and the sound design adds to the unpleasantness of the surroundings as Dante scales walls, full of imprisoned souls, forever crying out for forgiveness and mercy, cries which will never be heard or answered in hell. The atmosphere is impeccable. This is truly a hopeless place. You don't want to go there. The disturbing imagery goes beyond the level designs to the character designs themselves. The game has quite a bit of nudity in it. This game definitely out-boobs God of War, but the Cleopatra boss fight, which I will not be showing footage of, takes it to a disturbing level, and not because of the nudity aspect. For those who haven't played this game, I'm sure you can find footage of this boss fight to see what I'm talking about. The rest of you know what I am alluding to. Some things cannot be unseen once seen. Combine the gore, the unsettling art designs, and nudity, and you have a game that very much earned its mature rating. Strangely enough, when I finally played the original God of War, some of my favorite parts of the game were the adventure and exploration elements. These added a lot more depth to the game than I first assumed would be there. And the puzzle and exploration scenes in Dante's Inferno are also well done and well designed. Add in a varied assortment of regular enemies, some of which take their own strategies to kill, on top of visceral combat to the exploration and adventure elements, and you have a formula for an engrossing adventure that will pull you in from start to finish. The combat is fast, frantic, and fun, and the rest of the game around it is just as well designed. The boss fights range from slugfests you can sometimes cheese your way out of to very formulaic in nature. Some bosses follow strict patterns with small openings to do damage, while others are slugfests where you have to look for visual clues to dodge or block certain attacks before they unleash them on you. I do like that these fights are both and not either or. Some bosses have a mixture of both strict patterns and slugfests. The boss fights are well thought out and well designed, and as with other games of this ilk, can be incredibly frustrating until you learn those patterns. If you die repeatedly, the game will let you lower the difficulty mid-game in case you are struggling. On my first playthrough, I played on the second from easiest difficulty, and I didn't finally concede to lowering the difficulty to the easiest level until the final boss fight. My second run-through with a more powered-up Dante was a lot easier, so I actually do suggest playing your first run on the easiest difficulty to level Dante up before trying one of the higher difficulty levels in the game. It's probably not impossible to play your first run on the hardest difficulty, but you won't see me attempting it. Dante's Inferno does something that I have accepted as a thing in God of War and games like it. Something I think is fine for games like Shenmue, and that work in classic games like Dragon's Lair and Parappa the Rapper, and that's the addition of quick time events. I have always hated quick time events being infused into games. Again, I've accepted them in God of War and even Dante's Inferno because the rest of the experience is so good. I've never thought they added to the games, they're just kind of there. I've never seen them as something that improves the experience. I mostly see them as a negative. However, in games where the rest of the experience makes up for it, I can tolerate them. That being said, especially in modern games that throw them into cutscenes and in parts of the gameplay they don't belong, I absolutely detest QuickTime events. I find them to be stagnant, lazy design that needs to hit the dustbin of gaming history and never be brought out again. I've stopped playing whole games because of the QuickTime events in them. Some of the games, they are tolerable. However, the vast majority of modern games that are still using this stagnant design idea to create cheap deaths or make sure we're paying attention to their yawn-inducing, overdone, poorly written narrative cutscenes that the developers have wasted extra millions of dollars infusing into their games, they aren't a needed gimmick. How about save your money on the story elements and design some better games? Too much to ask in the modern age of gaming, I know. This is why modern gaming, I think, is mostly trash, with a few good games thrown in there. For me, the QuickTime events in Dante's Inferno are just kind of there. Not great, but not a huge complaint. My only other two complaints for this game, one, are the carpal tunnel inducing mechanics to do things like open doors. After hours of play, my forearm was aching from this game. However, I later realized that you don't always have to mash the buttons like this game is Mega Man. There was also a later scene in the game that just didn't jive well. A scene that was sort of a gauntlet where you had to kill a certain amount of enemies using specific attacks. To the game's credit, there is a save point after every one of these trials, but on my first playthrough I struggled a lot to pass this scene. I killed it on my second playthrough. This is the only scene I really didn't jive with in the game. The rest of the game flowed just fine. Graphically, the game looks good. It's not on the same level as God of War 3, but the visual design shines and the game looks good overall. The music is also fantastic and fits the action well with its epic nature. And even in the parts where there is no music, the ambient sounds fit the unsettling mood of the game perfectly. The sound effects in combat are beefy and hard-hitting, and the voice acting is exemplary. This game looks good, plays great, and sounds great. Visceral Games delivered here on all fronts. Dante's Inferno was smartly released a month before God of War 3 hit on the PS3, and for PS3 owners this game would have been another great way to satiate their appetite until the big one hit. However, for Xbox 360 owners who chose that system as their upgrade path from the PS2 who were God of War fans, this game would have been a godsend, filling that God of War void for them. While the 360 has some similar games in its library, I would say the PS3 library is by far more competitive now, having every God of War game up to that point remastered and re-released on the system. God of War 3 and Ascension. And even games like Heavenly Sword, competing for your attention if you are collecting for the system today. Not to mention similar-ish games like Devil May Cry, Ninja Gaiden, and Bayonetta. However, even amongst that god-tier level of competition, Dante's Inferno is still worth playing in my humble opinion. The bottom line here is that if you are a God of War fan, you owe it to yourself to play and enjoy Dante's Inferno. The entire experience, from the visual design, engaging combat, storytelling, and adventure elements, combine to form an excellent God of War clone. It may not surpass God of War overall, but Visceral Games put enough polish on the game to make it as close to being on par with God of War as it could be. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with this game and played through it multiple times, and I trust this game will also draw those willing to give it a shot in the same way. An engrossing, unsettling, and enjoyable game. A divine game.